Well, Mel, it was really fun having parted today in the kitchen with you cooking. It was maybe my favorite day I've had this year.
That was good.
It was delicious.
But you know how we let the pork rest?
Yeah.
I didn't get a nap.
Well, hopefully we'll just relax now and have conversation.
Okay. All right,
How's that?
Good. That's good.
So I want to know so much more now about Coleman Natural and about your family, your history, where it all began, how it began, when it began. So we're going to be celebrating 150th anniversary. Mm-hmm. And that was when your family first started cattle ranching, right?
Actually, yeah, and I don't want to go way, way back.
Okay.
But part of the family moved out from Altoona, Pennsylvania, came out to Colorado. Wow. And we basically started ranching in what's my hometown, Saguache, around 1875.
Wow.
So, and that was in the early days, kind of the gold rush.
Yeah.
So started ranching in the San Luis Valley. And then over the years, what we did is we expanded the ranch to go over the Continental Divide, over toward Gunnison into the what they call the Cochetope. Mm-hmm. Cochetope was a used word that meant buffalo. Oh. And so we ranched over in Buffalo Park and did stuff like that. And in the early days, a lot of the grains would be hauled with ox cart wagons.
Yeah.
Over from Saguache into the Gunnison country, and sometimes up into Leadville. So a lot of the beef would go from the ranch, or actually the cattle would go from down in the San Luis Valley, where we were, mm-hmm. Up into Leadville, where the miners were.
Wow.
And so that was kind of a thumbnail sketch of the livestock business in the valley.
Uh-huh. Did you have to move cattle around a lot? I mean, it's pretty high elevation there. Did they have grass year-round? How did that work?
So my hometown and where I was born, and the ranch I was born on, was at about 7,700 feet, 7,800 feet. And then when we had a couple of other places that were moving west over the Continental Divide, and so in the early 60s, my dad and granddad bought a ranch that was, and his brothers, bought a ranch that was about 45 miles away.
Wow.
So what we would do is winter the cattle in Saguache, in the San Luis Valley, and then we would summer those cattle and we'd move them on horseback. It'd take about 5 or 6 days, depending on where they would go. And we'd use a combination of private land and then BLM and forest land. Mm-hmm. So we leased a lot of forest land and ran cattle over a really large area.
Wow. That's pretty incredible. So, and even way back then, your grandfather, your father, Coleman has always been all natural. So obviously cattle in their natural environment, they're on grass, they're being moved around. That's an environment that's, speaks to who they are as animals, right?
Yeah.
So why was that important? And I guess, and how do we bring that forward today? Because now Coleman is known for these quality pork products, right? Mm-hmm. You're not cattle ranching anymore, but it's still based in that legacy of all those quality pillars that are really important to people today, right? People really care about where their food comes from.
Yeah, and so Tracy, if I back up a little bit,
sure,
and then answer that. But if I back up a little bit, what used to happen is that all the ranches, they would raise hay in the summertime, and then feed that to their cattle in the wintertime.
Nice.
All right? Mm-hmm. And so they'd all turn their cattle out into the rangelands. Uh-huh. And pretty soon, in the 20s and 30s, they began to realize, wait a second, these cattle are overgrazing this. Uh-huh. And so what happened is that the Taylor Grazing Act came in. So what they would do, working with the USDA, actually the Forest Service, they would have allotments. Oh. And so each ranch was allotted a certain area. Mm-hmm. So from a conservation point of view, my granddad was a conservationist, Dad was. We did a whole lot of things in those days. And we'd take these large areas, high desert ground, so there was took a lot of acres per animal.
Sure.
But we would fence these areas off, we would heavily graze them, and then we'd let that land rest. It was mimicking the migration patterns of the buffalo.
Amazing.
Okay. And so we'd heavily graze them, then we'd let it rest, and what we found out, and Dad did tests every 5 years for 50 years. And we found out that if you heavily graze the land, really use it, let it rest, you can actually increase the grass density, improve the watershed. What I mean by watershed is that the land's ability to hold water and snow, okay, before it runs off. And so from a conservation point of view, it was something that was kind of established going back to some of the mistakes that were made, or not mistakes, but, you know, we're overgrazing this, so how do we change that? And so over the years that was changed. And so I can remember as a young kid going up into the mountains and building fence all day to fence off these pastures.
Amazing. So your dad was really a pioneer of rotational grazing, what we hear about today. So he really knew to do it way back then, and now people are trying to do that more today.
So, and now what's happening even on private land. This was on really large acreages of public lands, right?
Right.
But now on private lands, what's happening is that people are cutting up their land into smaller pastures, and then rotate cattle or sheep or goats, whatever the livestock is on that land, and they'll rotate them sometimes a couple times a day, maybe hours. Okay,
that's amazing.
And so it's something that's really caught on, and I think it was kind of the, a hot button word at one time was sustainability.
Right.
Now everybody's using regenerative.
Correct.
And if you really look at farmers and ranchers, they've always wanted to be good stewards of the land.
Sure.
All right. But back to kind of where you were headed with the other question is about how livestock are raised.
Correct.
You can talk about the land, and then you can talk about the people and the values that they have in raising that, and then you can talk about the management practices with the livestock. And so we always use antibiotics. If a calf was sick, you treat them. But if you fast forward now into the late 70s, my brother and sister-in-law were going to the University of Colorado, and their son had allergies. And so what they were doing is that they were shopping at first at a co-op. They helped organize a co-op. And what they were looking for is that they were looking for foods that were a lot cleaner. But they were looking for beef that had been raised with no antibiotics and no growth hormones. And growth hormones, all animals have hormones,
correct,
but they were added hormones, like an athlete on steroids, okay? And it was something that we never believed in. And so my brother and Nancy and Greg were looking for clean foods to feed their son and themselves. And so what that evolved into was, where do you shop? Over dinner table discussion. Well, we shop at a natural food store. And Dad says, well, I can raise them this way, so I'll call it natural beef. So as time moved forward, what we did is that he had some beef hanging in a plant, and the USDA guy was rolling it after he inspected it with the USDA. Dad was standing next to him, rolled it with natural. The inspector said, you can't do that. And he said, why not? And he said, you can't roll it, okay? You have to establish that definition. So, he thought, well, this will be easy. And what he thought would be weeks turned into almost a year or more. And with the USDA, the original definition for natural talked about the way the animal was raised. Right. Vegetarian diet, no antibiotics. If an animal got sick, treated it, sold it into the commodity markets, but it didn't go into the natural program. Right. So no antibiotics and no growth hormones, no added growth hormones. And that was basically how it was. And so the original, and that was approved by the USDA, 1980. And about, within 6 to 12 months, okay, here you go, okay, big government and lobbying and whatever it was, they changed the definition that you could call a product natural if it was minimally processed and no artificial ingredients. Well, think about that. That doesn't have anything to do with the animal. Has to do with the meat.
Right.
But doesn't. And so then everybody started calling their products natural. So what we've done is that over the last 4 decades or 5 decades, whatever it is, okay, just been educating consumers on what all natural really is, what natural means to us.
Yeah. And clearly what it means to Coleman and the quality results that you get are different than it is for a lot of other people out there calling their product natural.
You know, we always thought that when you didn't use growth hormones and antibiotics mixed in the feeds, that it made the product taste better. And we always felt that. But rather than us telling people that it would taste better, we waited for meat directors in the early days. Meat guys would tell us that old-time meat guys been cutting meat. That was their career, and they go, oh man, this stuff cuts like beef used to. And then they would eat it and they'd say, this is the way beef used to taste. And so that whole thing moved into parlaying into getting involved in pork. And so a major part of what Coleman does right now is pork.
Yes.
And what we want to do is we want it to be raised right, raised with the right people that share our values, and use the kinds of breeds we're using Duroc, so that what you end up with is a product that really tastes good.
Right.
People will buy things based on their values, but if it doesn't taste good, they're not going to buy it again. So a really key thing that we do is that to me, do all these things right, but if it's got to taste good. You know, we'll hang our hat on the values that we stand for, but really at the end, what we want is that we want the product to taste good so that families can enjoy something that's just got this clean, great taste.
Yeah, we definitely saw proof of that today.
Yeah, we did.
Or tasted proof of that today.
It tasted good. And you know, the things that we tried is that nowadays, especially with pork and after the other white meat, well, what they were trying to do is compete with poultry.
Right.
And what they did is they took the taste out of it. So now you see a whole lot of recipes that are basically all kinds of sauces, all different kinds of things that you can do to make the pork taste better.
Right.
So really, the other white meat is just a carrier of flavors.
Of a flavor they put on top of it.
It just carries. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And so that's why some of the things I did do are just really simple.
Yeah.
And like the rub that you did, it's simple. Okay.
Right.
And yet what it does is that it doesn't, it accentuates the flavor of pork in different ways. But
doesn't
anyway.
detract from it. Yeah, I agree. So Mel, we know, consumers have become very savvy about what they buy and the reasons why they buy it, right? So those better for pillars, like better for them, better for the animal, better for the planet. One of the things about Coleman is that you feed the hogs an all vegetarian diet. Tell me about why that's important and how that affects the end result.
So all animals and poultry need protein. And so you find out that there's a whole lot fat, for example, and a whole lot of things that are high in protein that could be mixed into animal feeds and make that feed ration less expensive. And so we just never thought that was the right thing to do. And so when we say all vegetarian fed, basically what happens is that, we've had people say, well, what about the cow's mother's milk or the pig's milk? Come on, give me a break.
Right.
Okay, that's a natural process and everything, but what we don't do is we don't add any non-vegetarian, whether it's fats or whatever, bone meal, whatever it might be, to the ration, just because it has a high protein value.
Wow, really interesting. Yeah.
We just didn't think it was right.
Yep.
And so that's why we did that.
And does feeding it the vegetarian diet, so you're not adding bone meal and fats and things like that. So is that why the pork tastes so pure?
I really don't know the answer to that. I would imagine it might impact it some. But the main thing, if you add animal fats or bone meal or whatever to livestock feeds, what it does, it makes the cost of production cheaper. But I just think that it's a bad way of doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a corner you didn't want to cut.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, earlier we were talking about, in fact, you mentioned it, you talked about the animals and you talked about the planet. One of the things that I like to do is talk about the people.
Yeah.
And the small family farms and ranches, as everything starts getting bigger, what they're locked into doing is that they're locked into selling their product, their animals
Right.
into the commodity markets. Well, sometimes there's a big problem with that. One, they can dictate the price. You can't compete with the guys that are maybe really large and maybe family owned. But it's the small guys. It's the small family farms and ranches that, whether they're raising pork or beef or lamb or whatever it might be, we provide those families with an alternative market that pays a higher price than the commodity markets for some of the things that we require to do, so that consumers can be assured that what we say we're going to do, we actually do. And indirectly, Coleman kind of just stands in the middle of aggregating a number of farmers, all right, bringing their product in, making sure that the quality is right, paying them more for doing it our way, but providing families with product with clean, natural foods, meats.
Well, that's a very proud family legacy to carry forward, I think. Thank you for doing it.
Well, I mean, you're
need
welcome.
We need more Colemans in the world.
Well, it's one of the things that Dad did. One time he was asked, he said, in the early days, and he said, well, how big would you like this to be? And he said, I'd like to see the whole industry change to be doing this. And then the question was, well, what would you do then? Because the whole industry would be changed.
Yeah.
And he said, I'll cross that bridge when we get there. We'll have to figure that out later.
He seems like a wise man.
Well, he was, and really what it was is that, and I can even remember times that I would go in and talk to retailers, and we'd say, yeah, I'm Mel Coleman with Coleman Natural. Well, does that mean what I've got now is unnatural? And you go, no. Meat departments were one of the last places in the store that started looking at what consumers really wanted and selling that product. There was a number of consumers, even back when we first started in the early 80s, that were saying, I don't want antibiotics, I don't want growth hormones. And so we just wanted to produce wholesome foods. When we explained to the meat directors, the meat managers, whoever's running the meat departments, we're not trying to say that this product is unnatural. We're just trying to reach consumers that are in your store right now that want this kind of product. Yeah. And so that's basically how it's grown over the years.
Yeah. So today, Coleman, you've just gone through a whole rebrand. We're celebrating 150th anniversary.
Right.
You have all kinds of products to take to market now. Today we did ribs, we did pork chops, but you also have grinds. You have Italian sausage, chorizo. Tell me about where Coleman is going today. It seems to be expanding and offering more variety of products to consumers. Is that right?
The first sentence in one of the old mission statements we had was, by understanding our customers, we will, and then provide them with the values that they're looking for in great tasting natural pork.
That's great. And I think consumers now, they want the better 4 pillars. They really care about the quality of what they're feeding their families. Yeah. But it also has to be affordable, which, Coleman is a premium product, but it is accessible to a lot of families.
Right.
And it's convenient. Some of these products are just convenient. I feel like the one thing we don't have any more of, no matter what happens in the world, is time, right? So
right.
It allows that layer of convenience, like you could come home and have tacos ready for dinner in 20 minutes or something like that with one of the grinds.
We're going to be coming out with a ton of additional recipes that are really kind of convenience oriented. And when I use, for example, on the chops, just the salt and the pepper.
Salt and pepper.
That's really all it took.
So perfect.
And so, I'm going to reiterate again, great tasting products is what it's all about. If it doesn't taste great, you can raise the animal right, you can process it right, but if it doesn't taste great,
right.
And that's the way that you build a brand and a true legacy.
It really feels like wine to me in a way, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, that these heritage breeds, the way they're raised, what they eat, the product it produces. Winemakers will always say, you can't make good wine from bad grapes, right? No matter how hard you try. And it reminds me of what you're saying right now. Yeah.
When you talk about consistency and great taste, with our farmers, what we've done is that we're a Duroc program. In other words, we can label it as a Duroc program. What that means for retailers is they can be happy with the fact that what we're doing is that it's kind of a stamp of quality. But with consumers, what we'll do is that we will continue to do the kinds of things that we need to do to even make the Duroc program better tasting and more satisfying.
So Mel, we've talked a lot about Coleman brand, where it started, where it is, where it's going, who you are, and your family legacy. And I know that you're involved in another program too, where Coleman does other good in the world, Pups for Patriots. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that program and why you chose it and why it's important to you, and what specifically it does?
My granddad spent a whole lot of time doing things with organizations that were of benefit to everybody. My dad did the same thing, and my mother's been a volunteer in a hospital they gave her, said 20,000 hours.
Wow.
Okay? When we found out that 22 veterans commit suicide a day, we thought, we got to do something about that. And so what we did is that we thought, all right, Bart was nervous but feeling comfortable with 500,000. We had another guy in the organization that says, just don't go over 8. So I got up and I said, okay, we're going to commit to $800,000. And what the program is all about is some of these veterans that have got post-traumatic stress and different kinds of problems like that. We can help train the dogs. And so what it was is that they're taking dogs. We partnered with American Humane, and the Pups for Patriots program is underneath their programs. And they take dogs that were in the pound. They kind of sift through and find the dogs that can be trained. Then they train them, and then they train the vet that needs them. But it was pretty expensive, okay?
Sure.
This summer in June, I think what we'll do is that, and we're relatively a small company, but we're going to make the $1 million mark.
Wow.
So $1 million toward trade-in dogs for vets. And so I'm going to tell one real quick story about something that really resonated with me. It was a vet that came back. He had some issues. They trained a dog. He could not get a driver's license because if he got into this, would just get off in this, I'm going to call it a zone.
Right.
My words,
Yeah.
okay? Get in this zone and was not able to drive. They wouldn't give him a driver's license. They trained the dog to sense when he would get in that zone.
Wow.
And today, as long as the guy's got the dog with him, he can drive. Sometimes we just need to give back,
Yeah.
and plant seeds.
Yeah.
Farmer plants seeds, gets a big crop.
Wow, that's really remarkable.
Yeah, it is. And it's also, it's been a lot of fun knowing that we could do that.
Yeah. Mel, it's been wonderful speaking with you today, and it was great to catch up, and I really appreciate the time. And if there's anything, last parting thoughts you want to leave us with, I'd love to hear it. Here's to the next 150 years and to going back to the original where we said we were going to change agriculture, right? Sounds like you're doing that.
If you look back to when 150 years ago, when still parts of the West were being settled. We had the gold rush days. We had everybody scurrying around to do that and all those things. But agriculture became not only a source of food, but it took a lot of courage, a lot of tenacity, and a lot of faith in God to get a lot of that stuff done. Looking back at 150 years, things in a way were much more difficult, but a lot simpler. And what my concern is for the next 150 is that we don't train our children with the history and the understanding of where we came from and how some of these things happened. Tracy, I was reading a book. What the book was talking about is that the book was talking about when the settlers, and this goes before the 150, first came to the United States. The tools that they brought were basically the same kind of tools of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
You look at what happened in the United States, what happened in rural America, what's happened in our country in the last 150 years, we went from horse and buggy to cars to trains to putting a man on the moon in less than 150 years. And so what was the attitudes, what were the values that we had that got us to that point? And I think that what we do today is that because we don't look at history, not only back to 150, but even before that, and study history, and understand what's the true foundation of American values and everything. You know, I challenge anybody to go back and find out what they dedicated this nation to when they planted the first flag, and what our Constitution was all about, and what our Bill of Independence was all about. Urban society has no clue about where their food comes from, nor the values and the relationship that man had with how to treat animals, how to steward is a better word, the environment, our land and our water resources, and some of the values that those families had to have. Whereas a farmer, you plant a seed, you have to have faith that it's going to grow. And so what we lost a lot of that. So, in conclusion, if we'll look at what happened in the past 150 and parlay it into the next 150, what we're going to do is we're going to see a whole lot of change that's to the good in our society.
Amen to that.